So, Brett, tell us about the records that you obtained. How did the government know about the potential for violence when Mi'kmaq harvesters launched their moderate livelihood fishery?
Well, they got an early warning in the form of a letter from Sipekne'katik Chief Mike Sack on September 11th. That is, he specifically warned RCMP and DFO about an impending protest that was scheduled for September 15th. He was worried that this protest could potentially turn violent, and he called on both of those agencies to protect the Mi'kmaq fishers. Of course, the DFO did not need Mike Sack for that info. The DFO has an internal law enforcement agency called Conservation and Protection. It's commonly abbreviated as CNP. And within CNP, there's a National Fisheries Intelligence Service. And this National Fisheries Intelligence Service was closely monitoring the situation. They were closely monitoring the protest activity of the industrial fishers, and prior to the September 15th protest, they knew the itinerary, they knew everything about this planned protest, right down to the key spokespeople. And so the following day, on September 16th, this was the day before the launch of the moderate livelihood fishery, a fishery intelligence officer submitted a briefing email to their superiors, and this briefing email warned that there was a what they called a counter protest scheduled for September 17th. They warned that commercial fishermen were planning to haul all the gear out of St. Mary's Bay that the Mi'kmaq people set there. So they were aware of impending vigilante violence, and yet it's not clear that they did anything to intervene.
So, like, how unprepared were they? If they knew all of this, and then we saw how it all unfolded, is there any reason why there was no action, or were they unprepared?
Well, the short answer is that it doesn't appear that they actioned on this intelligence. So there was a bit of jurisdictional wrangling that was happening behind the scenes. And of course, on September 17th, the livelihood fishery launched at about noon. And we saw throughout the day a pretty chaotic scene unfolding. You know, at night there was flares shooting, a floating blockade that had encircled the Mi'kmaq fishers. The following days there was boat ramming, chasing, harassment and fighting on the wharf. And of course, all of that led to mob violence and arson about a month later. And even casual observers pointed at the time that there was virtually no law enforcement present. And there was, of course, minimal RCMP presence on land, and they took a lot of criticism for that. And these documents can show how that came about. So for one example, here is a situation report from September 18th, dated 5 p.m. that we can show you. And it revealed how dire that situation was. According to this document, there was 200 vessels in St. Mary's Bay at that time, with more arriving. Meanwhile, Mi'kmaq fishers were heading down to the wharf to set their traps. But the RCMP had only one boat, which was a ridged hull inflatable vessel, a Zodiac boat. Several Coast Guard ships were in transit. They had been activated the day before, but they hadn't arrived yet. Meanwhile, DFO fishery officers had been issued an operational directive to observe, record, and report. They had essentially been stood down by their superiors, who believed that it was just too risky to go out there and enforce the Fisheries Act. And so what happened is what you saw, that there was a great deal of chaos on the seas, and no rule of law of any kind that was being upheld.
So what was the government's response in the documents that you have, the government's response to all of this happening?
Well, there were two types of responses. There was a law enforcement operational response and then a policy response that was being undertaken at the same time by bureaucrats. So on the law enforcement side, by September 19th, the Marine Security Establishment was firing on all cylinders. The Coast Guard had arrived by September 19th. There was aircraft there. They were monitoring, but there was still a bit of confusion about who was going to enforce what laws against whom. Throughout this entire thing, internal DFO briefing reports, known as situation reports, indicated that they viewed the Mi'kmaq livelihood fishery as itself a form of protest. Prior to its launch, they were planning on ramping up engagement activities against the Mi'kmaq, so at no point did they actually consider protecting them. They viewed this livelihood fishery as unauthorized, contrary to the Fisheries Act, and subject to enforcement. And the RCMP, in an internal document, stated that they viewed wharf access as a DFO matter, whereas DFO stated that they viewed, harassment and violence as an RCMP matter. So there was a bit of jurisdictional confusion on the ground.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up. There are lots more that people can get the details of on our website, aptnnews.ca. Thanks so much, Brett, for joining us. We look forward to the fallout from this. Great work.